My talk's going to be a little bit different than a lot of the ones we've seen today. I'm not going to be talking about any particular projects or no restoration, tamarisk removal, anything like that. But I will be talking about trends that we've seen in riparian birds in the state of Utah for the last 20 years or so. So to give you a little bit of background, some of you might be familiar with breeding bird surveys. This is a continent-wide survey effort that's been in effect since 1966. And to be able to get an idea of the trends of breeding birds throughout the continent. One of the things they started to realize from the breeding bird surveys is that neotropical migratory birds populations appeared to be declining continent-wide. And this led to the formation of Partners in Flight in 1990. Now, Partners in Flight is a collaboration of academia, governmental agencies, private groups, NGOs, and that kind of thing that are all working together to protect at-risk species as well as keeping common species common. There are over 450 species of birds that occur in Utah at different points throughout the year. About a quarter of those are neotropical migratory birds. Those are the ones that we all think about that breed in the U.S. and then go south for the winter to Central and South America. And over 70% of the birds that are found in Utah are found in riparian habitat for at least part of their life cycle, whether it's just foraging, breeding, as a migratory stopover, or even overwintering. And riparian areas in Utah make up less than 1% of the total area in the state. They're very diverse, from high elevation streams all the way to meandering streams areas in the valleys, to just being some green vegetation along the bottoms of the river reaches and the canyons. You know, since you're here, you're probably all aware of the different threats that riparian areas are under, from development, drought, energy development and water development, both fire cycle changes, improper grazing, and OHV use, and the one that we've been talking about most the last couple of days, invasive plant species, which the two biggest invasive tree species in Utah are the Russian olive and tamarisk. And those are the only two pictures you'll see of those in this whole talk. So the breeding bird survey provided trends for many of the land bird species in Utah. However, they're not great for riparian species. The breeding bird surveys run along roads for 25 miles, stopping every half mile to record the birds. And not very many of these survey routes run along riparian corridors. There's one that I do that runs along the Colorado River near Moab for about half of the way. But in general, the BBS wasn't designed to pick up the linear type areas of riparian regions in the state. So the Utah Partners in Flight decided to do their own riparian bird monitoring to supplement the breeding bird surveys to see if there's a trend with the riparian birds in the state. This got started in 1992, and bird surveys continued all the way through 2011. And one thing to keep in mind is back in 1992 is before we had a lot of GIS and GPS units and all that kind of thing. So to be able to get full coverage of the state, they decided to use the 1 to 100,000 quads and get a site in each one of those throughout the state. And to determine the sites within those quads, they randomly numbered the non-ephemeral and stream reaches and visited the first three that came up, looking to make sure there was enough riparian vegetation to survey. These were at least 100 meters by 3,000 meters long, and they also had to provide some kind of reasonable public access to be able to return to the sites year after year for the long-term study. And we ended up with 37 sites, quads. If they visited them and could not find vegetation within the first three places that they visited, they ended up skipping the quads. And so that ended up leaving a lot of the western part of the state, and Basin and Range wasn't covered very well. So we're biased more towards the eastern part of the states and also lower elevation. About more than half of our sites were either on BLM or Forest Service land, with some also on Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, and some state and private land. At each of the sites, we conducted distance sampling, where we recorded all the birds heard and seen for 8 minutes, as well as the distance to the birds from the survey point. We had 10 survey points per site. Each of these was visited at least 2 times a season, up to 5 times a season, with the surveys occurring generally from about mid-May till the end of June. So from these point counts, we were able to get quite a few different analyses looking at the species richness and relative abundance throughout the state, as well as site-specific occupancy of different species throughout the state, and also the density of bird species. And that's what I'm going to focus on today. So to estimate density for each species, we used program distance, and we used models that in the conventional distance sampling, where the only thing that would affect the detectability of the birds would be distance. But we also used models from the multiple covariate distance sampling, where we were able to include covariates that would also affect possibly the detection of the birds. And then we used the information theoretic approach to choose the best model for each individual species. Just to give you an idea of some of the covariates we used for the multiple covariate distance sampling, we looked at some of the spatial covariates for each of the sites, which included biophysical settings from the land fire data, ecoregion, whether it was in the Colorado Plateau, Central Mountains or Basin and Range area, the elevation of the site, latitude, the site itself, and then also a combination of the different spatial covariates in an additive model. Some of the survey covariates we looked at were ones that just affected the actual detection during the day of the survey. Some of these included year, the actual observer could affect detection, the day of year it is. Sometimes earlier in the season the birds are easier to detect because of their activity levels, and minute of the survey, like how late past sunrise it was. Sometimes the birds are more easily detected early in the day during dawn chorus, even though we stopped our surveys within 4 hours of sunrise to be able to minimize that difference. Maximum temperature also affects birds' activity. When it's really cold or really hot, they're less active. Same with wind. Sometimes the birds aren't as active when it's windy, and it's more difficult for the observers to hear them if they are. Also looked at type of detection, whether it's auditory or visual, and a couple of different models looking at time of day and year, as well as also including the temperature and wind. So once we had the density estimates for each year, we were able to determine trend for each species using a least squares line in a project using R. And for the results, we had over 2,100 surveys conducted in those 20 years and had over 200,000 observations of birds, of which we had 222 different species detected during that time period at least once during the 20-year surveys, which ends up, that's about half of all the birds that are found in Utah were detected during our surveys. And we were able to estimate density for 38 of those species, and these generally had at least 1,000 observations, which worked out to be at least 50 observations a year for those particular birds. So the 4 birds that we have found with the highest density, and this is for the entire state of Utah, were yellow warblers, and we found over 4 individual yellow warblers per hectare throughout the state. We actually had one site not too far from Park City, Utah, where we had about 29 yellow warblers per hectare, which is pretty amazing. And then the next 3 highest density birds we had were American robin, Warbling Vireo, and Spotted Towhee, all just under about 2 birds per hectare. As far as trends, the yellow warbler had an increasing trend over during the course of our study, the 20 years. It has nearly doubled since 1992. And it was a significant increase at the 0.05 level. American robin, with the blue line, actually looks like there might be a declining trend for American robin. However, we were conservative, and it was only significant at 0.1, not at 0.05, so it may or may not actually be showing a trend. And for the other two, Warbling Vireo and Spotted Towhee, they show a slightly increasing trend, but again, that's not significant at the 0.05 or 0.1 level. So we were able to get trends for 38 species. Well, of the 38 species, we got density and trends for only 13 species showed a trend at a 0.1 level being conservative. And of those, only 4 showed declining trends. And of those 4, none of them were actually riparian specific or dependent species. One thing to note is 4 of the species that do have increasing trends are species that are generally considered more upland, shrubby type areas, and this could be indicating maybe some drying of our riparian areas, maybe some of the upland vegetation has moved into the riparian areas, but we're really going to need to look at that more, but it was just kind of interesting, that pattern. As far as species that were showing declining trends, these were American goldfinch, American robin, black-billed magpie, and house wren. And interesting to note that only 2 of those were actually significant at the 0.5 level, magpie and goldfinch. So we were curious to see how our results from the riparian areas matched up with the BBS survey results, since the birds we were seeing with the trends were not riparian specific. And they were pretty close. The breeding bird survey trends actually showed an increase in American goldfinch numbers over the same time period, at least up through 2010, which was the last year available of data, whereas the other 3 all went in line with what we saw, and they did show declining populations of black-billed magpies in Utah during that time period, and no trend for robins and house wrens. Another thing to consider from our research is we weren't able to estimate trends for at-risk species, the Southwestern Willow Flycatcher and the Western Yellow-billed Cuckoo. They weren't common enough in our study areas during the time period. We were doing our surveys as well, and so we didn't have enough observations to be able to model those guys. But some of our future directions, we want to actually be able to look for trends site-specific instead of just for the entire state, and see if there are any patterns that we might be able to pick out, or relationships that are more evident between different sites, and see if some of these might have been caused by weather or vegetation. And we actually have vegetation data to go along with the sites that's being looked over right now, and we're going to try to develop some species habitat relationships based on those. And from there, design some riparian habitat guidelines for restoration projects to take into consideration riparian birds when doing the restoration as well. So we did find some encouraging results. Only 4 species showed declining trends out of all the species, and they were expecting to have it be worse off than that. But we need to remain vigilant. We still have all the threats to the riparian areas with the drought, exotic species, and human activity. All of these which could be exacerbated by climate change. So we need to continue to protect and restore the riparian habitats, which all of you guys are working towards, which is why you're here. With that, I'd like to thank Frank Howe, Jim Parrish, and Russ Norvell, the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources. They're the ones that got the project going and kept it running for the 20 years, as well as funding and all the landowners and many, many technicians that made this work possible.
Any questions for Theresa? I'm just wondering how much longer are we continuing to monitor the times for
Yeah, it was 20 years. It was from 1992 to 2011, and that's the end of the funding. So the project's over. We're not continuing to survey these sites at this time.